The first thing you should know about Father Elias Thatcher is that he was never one to draw attention. He didn't boom from the pulpit or wave his arms through fire and brimstone. He wasn't the kind of priest who could fill a cathedral with his voice. No, Elias was quiet, gentle, the kind of man who looked people in the eye when they were breaking and held their hands like it was the last promise they'd ever receive. He had been in Wheatley for over 2 decades, a small town pressed against the ribs of the woods, with one church, one bakery, and not much else. People trusted Elias. They came to him with their confessions, their dying parents, their doubts about God, and he took it all in, like stone takes in rain, quiet, unmoving. But even stone can erode. Elias had entered the seminary at 19, not because he heard God's voice, but because he couldn't live with the chaos of his own. His mother was terminally ill, his father drunk and mean, and the world seemed full of knives. The church was the only place that felt clean, ordered, predictable. So he ran into it like a man runs into shelter. And it worked. For a time. Years passed. The collar became familiar, the prayers soothing. His days became a rhythm. Wake, mass, visits, write sermons, bury the dead. Comfort the grieving. Keep smiling. But hunger doesn't vanish just because you ignore it. It burrows deep, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Elias had buried that hunger beneath scripture, behind stained glass, inside the soft routine of ritual. But he could feel it now, just beneath the skin. Not lust, not yet. Something older, something more dangerous. Loneliness. It had crept in slowly, like cold through old windows. It showed itself in small ways, pausing too long at old wedding photos, hands trembling during morning prayers, eyes lingering at the pews after service was over, hoping someone would stay just a little longer. He didn't realize how hollow he'd become until it was too late. By 52, the town had stopped surprising him. The faces changed, but the stories didn't. Baptisms, affairs, debt, death, forgiveness, repeat. He would sit alone in the rectory at night, staring at the flickering candle beside his Bible, wondering what it meant to give your whole life to a God who never spoke back. And that's where he was, exhausted, devout, quietly unraveling, when she arrived. It was a Thursday morning when he first saw her. She was kneeling in the church garden, dirt on her hands, planting something with quiet focus. Her hair was pinned up, but loose strands curled against her neck. She moved with the grace of someone who had known pain and survived it. Their eyes met for only a moment, but something ancient stirred inside him. He looked away first. That night, he recited Psalm 51 3 times. "Create in me a clean heart, O God." But his hands trembled on the words, because something was shifting, something in the air, in his breath, in the way the candlelight danced like temptation on the wall. And for the first time in years, Elias wasn't sure if he feared falling, or if he needed to. Her name was Marin Hall, and she carried grief the way others carried handbags, close to the body, worn but familiar, and rarely set down. She moved into the yellow house just behind the churchyard in early April, when the town was still shaking off the last grip of winter. Daffodils were beginning to push through the frost-bitten soil, and on her first morning in Wheatley, she was already in the garden, bare hands digging, sleeves rolled, planting without hesitation. From the rectory window, Father Elias watched her. At first, he told himself it was curiosity. She was new, and in a town like Wheatley, new faces didn't go unnoticed. But there was something else, something quieter. The way she moved, intentional, grounded, like she was burying more than seeds. He visited 2 days later, a loaf of sweetbread in hand, the polite excuse of welcome on his lips. She opened the door in a pale sweater and damp jeans, her hair still messy from wind. She smiled, not the kind of smile parishioners gave him, not reverent or cautious. Hers was soft, human. "You must be Father Thatcher," she said. Her voice was low, melodic, touched by something old, like someone who'd learned to speak without expecting an answer. He stepped inside. The house smelled like lemons and lavender, and something else beneath it. Warmth, maybe. Memory. They sat at her kitchen table, sunlight pooling on the surface like spilled honey. She poured tea. No sugar, no small talk, just space. "My husband passed last November," she said, cradling her cup. "I'm sorry," he replied, his fingers tightening around the porcelain in his own hands. He had a good heart, but he never knew how to use it. He didn't ask what she meant. She didn't explain. That became their rhythm. Over the following weeks, Elias found himself stopping by more often. Sometimes with books, sometimes with soup, sometimes with no reason at all. Maren never pushed. She just made room for him. In her schedule, in her silences, in the way she listened, not like a follower of faith, but like someone who saw through the collar and into the man beneath it. It unsettled him, but it also felt like oxygen. She started attending Mass again, sat in the third pew, alone, always wore blue. Sometimes she stayed after everyone left, her fingers brushing the edges of the hymnals like they were memories. The town whispered, as towns do, but softly, because Maren carried sadness like a shield. And Elias, he was still the man people trusted with their children, their sins, their last breaths. He told himself it was pastoral concern, that he was checking in, offering support, that God would want him to help a widow find her footing again. But his prayers had started to drift. His thoughts wandered in the middle of rosaries, back to her hands in the dirt, her voice saying his name, the way she once touched his shoulder as she laughed. And in the dim hours of the night, when the church lay still and the world fell quiet, Elias felt it. Not temptation, not desire, but something far more dangerous. Longing. He wanted to hear her speak his name again, not Father, not Sir, just Elias. Stripped of role, stripped of robes, just a man in the presence of a woman who had known loss and still dared to plant something new. And though he said nothing out loud, the ground had already begun to shift beneath his feet. Because sometimes the most dangerous gardens aren't made of thorns. They're made of warmth and places to rest. It happened so quietly that even memory flinched to recall the exact moment. One evening, after a spring thunderstorm rolled through wetly like a restless ghost, Elias found himself standing at Maren's gate. He hadn't planned to visit. Not really, but there he was, soaked from the walk, collar unbuttoned, bread in hand. The air was still wet with petrichor. Lightning glowed in the far-off sky like a warning flare. Maren opened the door before he knocked, as if she'd been waiting. "You'll catch your death," she whispered, ushering him inside. The warmth of her kitchen was overwhelming. Soft lamplight, kettle already steaming, her cardigan hanging loosely from one shoulder. She handed him a towel and poured him tea, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said it. "You shouldn't be here." And he nodded. "I know." But neither moved. He sat across from her, his tea untouched, his eyes flickering to the curve of her wrist, the shadows under her eyes, the silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "I think about you," she said suddenly, quietly. He swallowed hard. "Maren," "No, I don't mean to be cruel," she cut in, her voice trembling. "But I do, and I don't know what to do with that anymore." Lightning flashed. Their shadows danced briefly across the walls. He looked at her then, really looked, and something inside him crumbled. The part of him that had held the line. The part that had wrapped guilt around his hunger like a rosary around a wound. He reached out. So did she. Their hands met in the middle of the table. His calloused, hers warm. And that was it. That was the moment. No gasping passion, no dramatic swell, just touch. Quiet. Sacred. A single heartbeat held in 4 hands. It was the kind of touch you never forget. Not because of what it led to, but because of what it meant. That he was still alive. That she wasn't alone. And that both were terrified of what that might cost them. They said nothing for the rest of the evening. Just held hands across the cooling tea and listened to the storm pulling away from town. When he rose to leave, she walked him to the door. Rain had started again, light this time, like the sky was whispering. She touched his chest lightly before he stepped out. "You're a good man, Elias." He should have corrected her, but he didn't. He stood in the rain again, for far longer than made sense. Not moving, not thinking, only feeling. When he returned to the rectory, he didn't undress, didn't pray, just sat in the dark with wet clothes and a beating heart. At midnight, he looked in the mirror, and for the first time in years, he didn't see a priest. He saw a man who had been seen. The Sunday after the storm was too bright, the kind of brightness that makes you squint, as if the sky itself is watching. The bells rang as they always did, the pews filled with wool coats and hymnals. Children fidgeted. Elderly parishioners smiled softly. And at the front of it all stood Father Elias, robe pressed, face unreadable, hands folded in prayer that couldn't reach past his skin. Maren sat in her usual place. 3rd pew, center, blue dress, head slightly bowed, eyes lifted, only for him. Their glances met for half a second. No one else saw it. But it felt like confession. That morning, his sermon was on suffering, on what it meant to carry wounds in silence. He spoke of Gethsemane, of Christ's anguish in the garden, of the weight of choice before betrayal. His voice didn't waver, but it dulled, as though he was preaching to himself. The congregation nodded, none the wiser. But Maren. She sat still, lips parted slightly, as if she knew every word was a cry hidden behind scripture. After communion, Elias stepped into the sacristy to remove his robe. His hands shook slightly as he undid the buttons. The room smelled of incense, wine, and linen, familiar scents that now clung to him like ghosts. And then he heard her voice. "Elias." He turned. Maren stood at the door, face pale, eyes rimmed with something that wasn't quite tears, but close. She looked like someone who had already made a decision. "I can't keep pretending," she said. "It hurts. This hiding. This hunger." He opened his mouth, closed it, took a breath. Then, "Don't pretend," he said, softer than a whisper. She stepped inside. He should have stopped her. He didn't. They didn't speak again. Not with words. She moved toward him, slowly, deliberately, as if every step erased a rule. Her hand reached for his collar. Not to pull it off, just to touch it. To acknowledge it. Then she reached past it, and he let her. They didn't kiss like sinners. They kissed like people who had been starving for something beyond explanation. Their bodies met in silence, reverent and trembling. They didn't rush. There was no heat, only ache, like prayer turned flesh. They made love in the quiet, behind a locked wooden door with saints watching in stained glass. And when it was done, They didn't speak. She lay against him, breathing steady. And for one brief moment, Elias felt something terrifying. Peace. Not guilt, not shame, just warmth. But peace, in stories like this, never stays. As dawn light filtered in through the narrow window, it turned everything a soft shade of scarlet. Her shoulder, his hand, the wrinkled robe on the floor. It looked almost holy. And that's what broke him, because holiness was never meant to feel this good. When Maren rose, she kissed his chest once, quietly, like a farewell. He dressed slowly, staring at his reflection in the glass pane of the cupboard. His collar hung loose in his hand. He didn't put it back on. He sat in the chair where he'd written 1,000 sermons and wept, not because he regretted her, but because he knew the cost. And the debt had already begun collecting. It began with a stare, not a word, not a whisper, just a stare. One of the altar boys, Matthew, caught sight of Maren leaving the rectory just before sunrise. Hair undone, eyes down, shoes in her hand. At first, the boy said nothing, but silence is brittle in small towns, and by Wednesday, it had cracked wide open. By Friday, the whispers had bloomed into full sentences. Concerned women mentioned changes in the father's sermons. Men muttered about boundaries, and someone, no one claimed responsibility, called the diocese. Father Elias received the letter in a plain envelope. No salutation, no threats, just a formal notice to report for inquiry. And beneath the signature, a phrase that landed like a blade: to protect the sacred. He didn't argue, didn't run, didn't try to explain, because there was nothing left to defend. He packed his things in the same silence he had once used to bury his hunger, folded his robes, cleaned his bookshelves, unpinned the photo of his mother from the corkboard beside his desk. He left a note for the congregation on the pulpit. It was brief. Forgive me, not for what I did, but for the walls I broke to feel human again. He left that night. No ceremony, no scandal. Just another name removed quietly from the church bulletin. Maren watched from her window. The lights of the rectory dimmed for the last time. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She simply placed a single rose at her doorstep in the morning. Scarlet red, like that Sunday. Elias was reassigned to a monastery retreat 3 states north. No collar, no sermons, just silence and earth. He tended gardens now. Ironic, really. He who had fallen in a garden of his own making now spent his days coaxing life from soil. Each morning, he knelt before the chapel, not in prayer, but in memory. Sometimes, he pressed his fingers to the wood of the pew and remembered her touch. Other times, he stared at the flickering candle and wondered if love that comes at such a cost was ever meant to survive. He wrote Maren once, a letter that took him 3 days to finish. It said nothing dramatic, no grand confessions, just, "You reminded me I was still alive. For that, I thank you. For the hurt, I am sorry. I hope you are planting again." She never replied. He never sent another. But sometimes, when the wind moved a certain way through the trees, he imagined she had read it. Imagined she had forgiven him. If not for the sin, then for the sincerity. The church eventually forgave him too, in the only way it knows how, by burying his past and handing him a shovel. He wore no collar now, but every now and then, when he caught his reflection in a rain-slicked window, he could still see it, tight around his throat, a symbol, a noose, a vow. Because faith, once it falls, doesn't always rise again. Not as it was. Sometimes it becomes quieter, lonelier, but strangely, more real. And that's where we leave him, an older man in a gray coat beneath a row of olive trees, digging, breathing, remembering. No longer a priest, no longer just a sinner, just a man who once gave his whole life to heaven, only to discover that heaven too can break your heart.